The plot was on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, an extensive area of land that few noticed as they passed along the state highway. For most, it was nothing more than a forgotten field, overgrown with tall grass and old fences. But for Daniel Whitmore, that piece of ground represented decades of family history, sacrifice, and silence. Inherited from his father, the land was the last concrete vestige of a family that always believed in doing things the right way, even when no one was looking. Daniel was not a rich or influential man. He worked as a building safety inspector, led a simple, organized life, and had an almost stubborn respect for the rules. Since his father's death, he had visited the site only a few times a year, more out of emotional duty than practical necessity. There were no immediate plans to build there. Still, he paid taxes religiously and kept all documentation in order. It was on an ordinary morning, during a work trip, that something changed. As he passed the side road that cut through the region, Daniel noticed movement where before there was only silence. Trucks, excavators, construction boards. He slowed down, feeling a discomfort that was hard to explain. When he stopped the car and got out, the shock was immediate. Machines were leveling his ground. There was no question. That was his property. Daniel did not shout or make a fuss. He approached one of the workers, who pointed to a makeshift sign with the name of a community association. According to them, the land had been earmarked for a community housing project aimed at low-income families displaced by abusive rents in the city. Something did not fit. Daniel returned home with a restless mind. That evening, he scattered documents on the kitchen table: registered deed, tax receipts, official maps. Everything was correct. The land was legally his. In the following days, the work moved forward with impressive speed. The project was not small. 100 houses were planned, all simple but well structured. Streets began to pop up, streetlights were installed, and volunteers showed up every day, helping in any way they could. There was something deeply human going on there. Daniel could have stopped everything with a single call. But he didn't. Instead, he observed. He returned to the field several times, always in silence. He saw families helping with construction, children carrying pieces of wood, elderly people offering food to volunteers. He heard stories without wanting to hear them. People who had lost homes, jobs, stability. People who finally saw a chance to start over. Conflict grew within him, not as anger, but as a weight hard to name. Legally, he was right. Morally, the situation was more complex. On the other side was Margaret Lewis, coordinator of the community project. A practical, determined woman, respected by everyone there. She believed, with absolute conviction, that the land had been ceded years earlier through an informal agreement with former local representatives. Nothing solidly documented, just promises and trust. Daniel never spoke to her at that time. He preferred to wait. Months passed. The houses took shape: roofs, doors, windows. The neighborhood began to look alive before it was even completed. And while the community celebrated each new construction, Daniel made a silent decision. He would not prevent the conclusion, but he wouldn't give up what was his either. As the project neared its end, Daniel began consulting with lawyers, gathering evidence, reviewing state laws. Every step was taken with care. There was no rush, no desire for revenge. Only the certainty that justice would need to be called, not to destroy, but to redefine the path. The question that accompanied him was not whether he would win the cause. That's what would happen next. And no one, not even Daniel, was prepared for the consequences of that choice. As the neighborhood took shape, the land ceased to be just an extension of land to transform into a living organism, pulsating collective effort. The still unnamed streets were crisscrossed by wheelbarrows, makeshift bicycles, and hurried footsteps. There was a sense of purpose in the air, something rare even in the most organized areas of the city. Daniel kept visiting the place at varying times. He wore simple clothes, kept his distance, and was rarely noticed. To residents and volunteers, he was just another curious observer. For himself, those visits functioned as a silent test of conviction. This is how he began to notice specific people. Ethan Brooks, a former school bus driver, now helped coordinate construction after losing his house in a sudden eviction. Lena Ramirez, a solo mother of two, worked during the day and showed up at night to paint walls. Harold Thompson, a retired veteran, took care of the organization of materials with an almost military discipline. Each carried a story, but no one there seemed willing to complain. The focus was always on what lay ahead. The PR. OJECT had no direct support from the city. It worked thanks to donations, volunteer work, and fragile agreements with local suppliers. That informality explained a lot. In Austin, especially in the outlying regions, community initiatives came and went frequently, often on the fringes of the official bureaucracy. Margaret Lewis was the linchpin of it all. She circled the neighborhood with a worn-out clipboard, jotting down details, resolving conflicts, and keeping up with the pace of construction. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't make long speeches. His leadership came from constancy. When problems arose, she was there. When something worked out, he let others take the credit. Daniel watched her from a distance, noticing something that made it all the more difficult. There was no bad faith. The mistake that put that community on its ground was not born of greed, but of over-reliance on old promises, on verbal agreements that were never formalized. Meanwhile, off the field, Daniel faced another world. In the lawyer's office, the atmosphere was cold, organized, far from the reality of the dusty streets of the new neighborhood. Official maps were projected on the wall, clearly defined boundaries, indisputable records. The law was objective. The land belonged to Daniel Whitmore, with no room for interpretation. The lawyer was blunt. Any lawsuit would result in almost immediate gain of cause. Still, Daniel urged caution. I didn't want a sudden eviction order. I didn't want sirens or headlines or confrontations. I wanted to understand all the legal possibilities before I acted. During this time, the neighborhood began to attract local media attention. Small reports highlighted the strength of the community, the spirit of solidarity, the example of unity in difficult times. None mentioned the legal fragility of the project. Daniel watched these stories in silence. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the newly built houses, Margaret gathered the prospective residents to announce that the project was nearing completion. There was applause, restrained hugs, discreet tears. For many, it was the first time in years that they felt secure about tomorrow. Daniel stood there, leaning against the old fence that still marked part of the original land. He knew that the decisive moment was approaching. With each completed house, the weight of his decision increased. But paradoxically, his conviction also became clearer. He did not see that place as something to be taken by force, nor as a mistake to be erased. He saw it as a situation that demanded responsibility, not impulsiveness. The conflict was no longer just legal. He was human, and how he chose to act would define not only the future of those 100 houses, but also who he would be after it was all over. With the progress of the works, the challenges began to arise with more intensity. What was once just physical effort and hope has come to involve critical decisions, tight deadlines, and increasingly scarce resources. The community needed to race against time to finish the houses before winter, and each delay seemed to threaten everything they had built. Daniel followed this closely, even without getting directly involved. He noticed when a truckload of materials stopped arriving, when volunteers had to improvise solutions, when exhaustion began to show on previously excited faces. Still, no one would give up. The first serious conflict occurred when a small local company refused to continue supplying materials without formal guarantees. With no official contracts, The project became even more dependent on the goodwill of donors and merchants. Margaret spent nights redoing budgets, negotiating deadlines, and reorganizing teams. Daniel saw everything. On a Saturday morning, heavy rain delayed part of the construction. Some unfinished houses suffered seepage, requiring immediate repairs. Tension increased, and for the first time more heated discussions arose among volunteers. The dream began to show its weaknesses. It was in this scenario that Daniel decided to act, not as an owner, but as a citizen. Anonymously, he began donating materials. Nothing to draw attention to, nothing to arouse suspicion. Simple deliveries, made through third parties. Wood insulation, basic tools. Little aids that kept the project moving. Margaret noticed the change. The unexpected deliveries relieved pressure and avoided critical delays. Still, she knew something was wrong. A project of that size didn't survive on goodwill alone. There was a missing piece in that puzzle. Meanwhile, Daniel was also advancing on the other front. The lawyers finalized the legal strategy. The action would be clear, objective, and based solely on documentation. No attack on the community, no moral accusation. Only the formal claim of ownership, with openness to negotiation of alternative solutions. Still, the impact would be inevitable. Daniel began to feel the isolation of the decision. Close friends, superficially aware of the situation, reacted with surprise. Some advised to act fast and protect their rights before it was too late. Others suggested putting the matter aside and avoiding trouble. None of them lived that conflict inside. On the ground, new families began to visit the almost ready-made houses. They measured spaces, imagined furniture, talked about schools and routines. The houses did not yet have official residents, but they already carried real expectations. Daniel realized that the conflict had evolved. It was no longer a question of preventing a work or correcting an administrative error. It was about 100 futures about to begin, built on an unstable legal basis. When the last roof was installed, a small event was organized by the community. Nothing formal. Only shared food, simple music, and short speeches. Margaret thanked the volunteers, families, and anonymous partners who helped along the way. Daniel watched from afar, with a feeling difficult to define. He knew the next step would change everything. The following week, the lawsuit was filed. There was no immediate fanfare. No siren, no unexpected visitors. Only formal notifications, delivered in a correct and respectful manner. Still, the effect was quick. The news spread among the project coordinators like a silent shock. Margaret received the documents in her makeshift office and read each page carefully. The owner's name was there, clear and undisputed. Daniel Whitmore. For the first time, the conflict ceased to be abstract. Now he had a face. And what came next would require more than reason or emotion. It would require choices neither side had foreseen when the first stake was driven into that ground. The revelation of the owner's name brought a new layer of tension to the project. Until then, the community's biggest challenge had been building houses with few resources. Now they faced something harder to deal with: legal uncertainty. Margaret did not immediately share the news with everyone. He preferred, first, to understand the situation completely. He met with 2 volunteer lawyers who had assisted the project on minor issues. The answer was straightforward, though careful. The documentation Daniel presented was solid. There was no official record of cession, donation, or sale of the land. The community was not there by legal right. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate. Some volunteers noticed changes in the climate of the project. Longer meetings, conversations interrupted when someone approached, worried looks. Insecurity began to quietly seep into the daily life of the newly formed neighborhood. Ethan Brooks was one of the first to openly question. He had been through evictions before and recognized the signs. The thought of losing a place to call home again made him uneasy. Lena Ramirez, on the other hand, tried to maintain a routine, but the tension was reflected in small things: delays, distractions, prolonged silences. Daniel, on his side, faced another equally complex subplot. The lawsuit was proceeding within normal procedures, but he formally requested that any initial decision be accompanied by mandatory mediation. This would delay the process, but it would open up space for dialogue. For the lawyers, it was an unusual choice. For Daniel, it was necessary. He didn't just want to win on paper. During this time, Daniel received an unexpected call. A former friend of his father's, who had worked years ago with community projects in the area, got in touch after recognizing the surname in public records. He told stories of the past, of failed attempts at partnerships between communities and local authorities, of promises made and never kept. These conversations did not change the legal facts, but they broadened the context. The mistake was not made by a single person. It was the result of years of informality, good intent, and institutional carelessness. In the neighborhood, Margaret finally decided to talk to future residents. He gathered everyone in one of the larger houses, still empty. There was no dramatization, just facts. He explained that the land had a rightful owner and that a lawsuit was underway. The silence that followed was heavy. Some reacted with indignation, others with fear. There were those who suggested protests, public pressure, exposure in the media. Margaret listened to everything, but held her ground. It would not allow the situation to escalate into confrontation. The most delicate subplot emerged at that moment: the internal division. While part of the community wanted to publicly fight the owner, another part feared it would make everything worse. Small conflicts began to arise, not because of a lack of unity, but because of the fear of losing what they had gained. Daniel unknowingly became a symbol for both sides. For some, the invisible threat; for others, a possible bargaining chip. The judge in charge of the case scheduled the first mediation hearing. For the first time since construction began, Daniel and Margaret would be in the same space, representing opposite sides of a story neither of them had planned to live. The subplots slowly converged to an inevitable point. It was no longer just about houses or documents. It was about trust, accumulated mistakes, and the possibility, still uncertain, of turning a conflict into something different. Time was pressing on everyone. The courtroom mediation room was simple, lit by white light, and far from any dramatization. There was no audience, no cameras. Just a long table, chairs lined up, and the silent weight of decisions that could change many lives. Daniel arrived early. He wore a discreet but unostentatious suit. He carried an organized folder with him, but what he carried most was the awareness that this meeting would mark a before and after. Shortly after, Margaret walked in accompanied by the volunteer lawyers. Seeing him for the first time, she did not show hostility, only careful attention. When their eyes met, something unexpected happened. Neither of them saw an enemy. The mediator began the session with objectivity, making it clear that the goal was not to judge, but to find possible paths. The documentation was presented. The legality of the property was evident. Margaret listened to everything in silence, making few notes. When it was her turn to speak, she did not dispute the facts. Instead, it described the human process behind the project. He spoke of the families, the hours of volunteer work, the children who already called those streets home even before they officially moved in. He didn't ask for favors or try to reverse responsibility. It just exposed reality. Then came the decisive moment. Daniel asked for the floor. He did not mention the inheritance, nor the value of the land on the market. He spoke of his father, of how he had learned to respect rules not to protect himself, but to build something lasting. He acknowledged the mistake that led the community there, but he also made clear that he could not simply give up the property without discretion or consequence. The room fell silent. Then Daniel did something no one expected. He submitted a proposal. Instead of asking for the removal of the houses or immediate compensation, Daniel proposed the creation of a housing foundation, where the land would be ceded through a long-term legal contract. The property would remain in his name, but the community would have formal right to use, finance, and regularize the dwellings. More than that, he would commit to donating part of the future value of the land to ensure maintenance, infrastructure, and legal security for residents. Margaret took a few seconds to react. The proposal was neither simple nor immediate. It required legal adjustments, new contracts, participation of the municipality. But it was real. For the first time since the beginning of the process, there was a solution that did not destroy what had already been built. The mediator asked for a break. Outside the room, Margaret called community representatives. Daniel did the same with his lawyers. Both knew that decision would require courage, not just from them, but from everyone involved. When they returned, the tension was still there, but there was something new in the air: possibility. Margaret agreed to go ahead with the proposal, conditional on full transparency and the participation of residents in future decisions. Daniel agreed without hesitation. The turning point was set. The conflict ceased to be a dispute over land and turned into a mutual reconstruction agreement, where no one would come out exactly the same, but everyone could come out better. And in that instant, it was clear that history would not be remembered for a court battle, but for a choice made when the easiest way would have been to simply win. The mediation proposal did not immediately resolve everything. On the contrary, it opened a new phase full of adjustments, doubts, and intense reactions. When the news reached the community, it spread quickly, accompanied by mixed feelings. Some residents reacted with immediate relief. The idea of not losing their homes, of having a legal basis to remain there, brought a huge weight off their shoulders. Others, however, received the information with caution. The word contract still caused fear in people who had already been frustrated by formal promises in the past. Margaret, it again assumed the role of balance. He organized open assemblies, patiently explained each point of the agreement, and allowed difficult questions. He did not soften the risks or sell illusions. Transparency, although uncomfortable at times, strengthened internal trust. Daniel, in turn, came to be seen differently. The man who was previously only the owner of the plot began to gain a more human face. Even so, he did not seek direct rapprochement with the residents at that time. I knew that trust is not imposed, it is built. On the legal side, the process has changed pace. The lawsuit was temporarily suspended to make room for the settlement to be formalized. Attorneys worked side by side with community representatives, reviewing clauses, defining responsibilities, and ensuring everything was in compliance with Texas state and city laws. The practical consequences began to appear quickly. The housing foundation created from the agreement allowed the project to finally have access to public support programs, something impossible while the land situation was uneven. This brought resources for paving the streets, proper connection of basic services, and regularization of houses. However, not everything was simple. Some old volunteers walked away, wary of the change in structure. Others feared the community spirit would be lost with formalization. Small conflicts arose, requiring constant mediation. Margaret began to divide responsibilities, forming internal councils so that decisions were not concentrated in one person. Daniel also faced backlash outside the neighborhood. Acquaintances questioned his choice. Some said that he had been naive, that he could have sold the land for a high value. Others quietly praised him. Daniel didn't answer much. For him, the decision was already made, and the important thing now was to deal with its consequences. Over the weeks, something changed in the general mood. Houses ceased to be just symbols of hope and began to function as real homes. Changes began to happen, still gradually. Doors received official numbers. Mailboxes were installed. Children began to play in the streets with less fear of the future. The conflict had not completely disappeared, but it had been transformed. Instead of a constant threat, it has become a process of adaptation. Each new step required effort, dialogue, and adjustments, but it also showed that the chosen path, although more difficult, was working. And quietly, Daniel began to realize that this decision wasn't just changing the lives of the community, it was changing his too. As the months passed, the transformation was visible, not just in the neighborhood, but in the people. Daniel began to participate more actively in the meetings of the foundation, always with discretion. I didn't want to be seen as a savior, just as someone fulfilling a responsibility. He had to learn something new, to lead without control. Instead of unilateral decisions, he listened. Instead of distant silence, he proceeded to explain his actions. This process was not comfortable. Daniel had always been reserved, used to acting alone. Now, each choice impacted dozens of families. In the community, growth was also evident. People who previously lived in uncertainty began to plan for the future. Some residents have started small businesses from home. Others returned to study. The neighborhood got an official name, chosen in a collective vote, a symbol of belonging. Margaret, in turn, began to divide responsibilities. After so long carrying everything herself, she allowed herself to trust more. The foundation now had a structure, clear rules, and active participation of residents. The next challenge was to make sure that place didn't become just another forgotten neighborhood, and this required continuous effort. The final regularization depended on one last step: the definitive approval of the agreement by the municipality. Without it, the project was still at risk. Public hearings have been scheduled. Residents spoke. Legal representatives explained. Daniel attended, not as the owner of the land, but as a partner in the project. His calm and objective stance helped dispel mistrust. Tensions rose as the decision neared. A rejection could jeopardize years of work. Every detail needed to be aligned. On the eve of the vote, the neighborhood was silent. There were no celebrations, just anticipation. Daniel walked the newly paved streets, observing lights on, simple dinners, lives happening. Regardless of the outcome, he knew he had made the right choice. The decision came on a clear morning. The city council approved the deal unanimously. The neighborhood was officially recognized. The houses began to have legal status. The foundation has become a model of partnership between private initiative and community. The reaction was immediate. Hugs, tears, restrained laughter. There was no exaggerated outburst, just a deep collective relief. The conflict that began with an INV, voluntary invasion of land, ended with something rare, a just solution for all. Daniel did not speak. He just stood there, watching. At that moment, his transformation was visible. He was no longer just the man who was right in justice. He was someone who understood that winning does not mean taking away, but building. Over time, the neighborhood consolidated. The houses have aged with dignity. Children grew up there. Stories multiplied. Daniel retained formal ownership, as per the agreement, but his bond with the place was much greater than a notarized registration. He had found a purpose he never sought. Margaret continued to work with community projects, now with more support and less improvisation. The experience served as a benchmark for other similar initiatives in the state. What started as a serious mistake has become an example of how everyday conflicts can be resolved with firmness, empathy, and responsibility. Years later, Daniel returned to the neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon. He sat on a bench in the central square, listening to laughter in the distance. The father's plot was not empty as before, it was full of life. And for the first time, this seemed exactly what it should be. Stories like this remind us that not every conflict needs to end in loss. Sometimes the real gain lies in seeing beyond the immediate right and taking responsibility for the consequences of one's choices. If this story touched you or made you reflect, share it with someone. Perhaps it will inspire other, more humane decisions in the real world.